located perfectly in Europe, as a gateway to Europe, we like to say, because the rivers go through to Germany, Belgium, France, and the whole of Eastern Europe.
Rotterdam is situated in a natural delta, and that means it, as a port, it caters to somewhat 350 million people. Until this day, trade comes into the port of Rotterdam, either in containers or goods, break bulk, and is then sort of divided into smaller portions and then taken upriver.
More than 100,000 ships pass through the port of Rotterdam, representing over $50 billion of value for the Netherlands every year. 50. And just for perspective, that is 6% of the gross domestic product of the country, all from these 41 square miles of port. But in the late 1800s, none of this was here. Rotterdam was a tiny city, and it had a bit of a problem. The river mouth was very shallow, and so if a ship wanted to come into Rotterdam, it had to take a long detour through canals and rivers. And it added days to the journey, which obviously wasn't good for business. So a group of entrepreneurs got together and hatched a plan. They dredged the river and they made a new waterway to the sea. And it was a game changer.
On those days we had what we call the havenbaronnen, the port barons as we call them, entrepreneurs, people who were looking for opportunities, and Anthony Platen, Lodewijk Pincoffs, and Otto Reuglin. They started the North American Shipping Company.
They formed the company in 1873 and they call it this. Any of our guests who don't speak Dutch want to give it a try? Nederlands-Amerikaanse Stoomvaartmaatschappij. Sounds pretty easy, right? So our first ship was called, of course, Rotterdam, and we painted her smokestack the colors of the city, green and white. The Rotterdam was built in Scotland and cost 30,000 guilders at the time. Millions and millions of dollars today. She was supposed to have this big splashy debut, but there was a strike at the shipyard, and so she arrived 6 months late. Because of that delay, her first voyage was a little light. She only carried 70 passengers. It was an inauspicious start for our company. And actually, our first 20 years weren't, let's say, spectacular. A lot came down to our name. It was pretty hard to sell tickets in America on the Nederlands-Amerikaanse Stoomvaartmaatschappij. And everybody was already calling us something else anyway. So we did what these days you would call a rebranding. And so we went from this to this. And that's the last time we were behind the curve. And by just a few years later, we had already taken over 1,000 trips with nearly 500,000 passengers. And things were only going to get better. Holland America Line was about to join one of the largest movements of people in the history of the world. See, for as long as America has been America, people have traveled from far away to make a new life in the United States. Before Holland America Line came around, it was difficult, it was expensive, and often it was extremely dangerous. In the early 1800s, so before our steamships, the voyage across the Atlantic was pretty miserable.
Immigration from, of course, the point of view from the Netherlands started in the 1830s. Sometimes they sailed as regular passengers with their own cabin, but most of them didn't have a lot of money because poverty was a reason to migrate, and they stayed in between decks. So they didn't have their own cabin, they just stayed in whatever bed was provided for them.
Those tween decks that she mentioned, or what you may also know as steerage, where most of the immigrants traveled, were extremely uncomfortable and very tiny. They were only 5 feet tall. The passage could take almost a month, and the conditions were often miserable. By the time our steamships came around, things had gotten a little bit better. The trip was a little shorter, but the conditions on the other liners were still pretty terrible. And yet, here's the thing. Nearly 11 million people immigrated to the United States in steerage. And so we had to figure out how to get some of those passengers. Now look, this was not going to be easy. Competition at the time was ferocious, especially because the other companies were, well, Let's just say that they were willing to play a little fast and loose with the truth.
It cost $10 to cross from Rotterdam to New York. $10 to an immigrant in the beginning of the 20th century was a lot of money. And they wanted the voyage that was safe and reliable. Immigrants were poor people, basically. They didn't go to travel agents, they didn't study brochures, but they'd go down to the railway station or the pub or the post office, and they would see these giant posters of liners going to America. So word spread that a ship with 2 smokestacks was safer than a ship with 1 smokestack. But a ship with 3 smokestacks was even safer. There's no correlation between smokestacks and safety, but they would look at the posters and count the smokestacks in the posters and pick that ship to spend their $10 on. Well, companies, thankfully Holland America didn't do it, used to add fake smokestacks to their ships so they would have more stacks on the top so the immigrants would go on their ship, so they called them dummy smokestacks. The second big story of that era, the immigrants had heard that if they ate raw onions for a month before they left Europe, they wouldn't get seasick. Total fallacy. There's no correlation between raw onions and seasickness.
First of all, we would all appreciate it if you do not try that raw onion cure, okay? Science has offered us plenty of methods that can treat seasickness that will not make you a social outcast on board. But anyway, the point is this. Holland America Line had to figure out how to get some of those immigrants on board our ships. And again, we weren't the fastest, we weren't the biggest. And we also weren't the cheapest. But despite all that competition, eventually 1 out of every 10 immigrants who traveled steerage to the United States did so on a Holland America Line ship. 1 out of every 10. And do you know why? Because we treated those immigrants like human beings deserve to be treated. And it all started at home in Rotterdam.
So here we're actually at the Wilhelminakade, but at this side it's called Holland America Quay. And this is the main street, you can say, in Rotterdam. So basically where we're at, this square kilometer is the history of Holland America Line. Just on the opposite side you have the Royal Yacht Club, where actually the deed, when it was started, the company, was signed, dined and wined. If you walk a little bit up along the quay, you will find Hotel New York, which was the original head office of Holland America Line, and I have heard so many stories of people going there, trembling knees, and how happy they were when they finally got on board.
That building, which served as both our terminal and offices, is where it all started. You can still see our name on the facade. Downstairs, immigrants came to purchase their tickets and to get ready for their long journey. Actually, the baggage area nowadays is a really nice restaurant with an amazing view. Upstairs were the offices, and today there are even a few rooms that have been named after our founders. After the immigrants purchased their tickets, they would wait for the ship to arrive to then take them to America. Sometimes, if they were lucky, they would only wait a few hours, but usually they waited for days and days.
When they stayed in Rotterdam, up till the 1890s, they mostly went, or I think all of them went to private boarding houses. And in the earlier days, the people of the boarding houses, well, they were not that fair in the prices people had to pay. And people like Pleet and Reuchlin, who were the founders of the Holland America Line, also saw this. So at the end of the 19th century, they built their own emigrant hotel.
And we built it just a few blocks from our head offices. And this was a huge part of the reason we were so successful in those early days. And this was much more than a hotel. We had a kosher kitchen, English lessons, classes on American civics, and even doctors and nurses who checked for lice and diseases. And when the immigrants finally got on board, they found something totally different from our competition. First, we did away with steerage class altogether, and we renamed it Emigrants class, where, unlike our competition, we serve 3 square meals in an actual mess hall to every passenger on board. For example, here's a menu from the turn of the century. Looks pretty good, right? Let's check out Monday. Sauerkraut, smoked bacon, potatoes, plum duff. Anyone ever heard of plum duff? To be honest with you, I had never heard of it, but it turns out it is a variant of the traditional Christmas pudding. Here's my favorite part. We still serve it on board our ships during our Christmas cruises. Our first class passengers had it even better. Oysters on the half shell, seared duck. By the way, I don't know if you noticed this, but this ship was called Potsdam. Now, we have repeated a lot of our ship's names in our history, but there's never been another Potsdam. Maybe Potsdam sounds okay in Dutch, but perhaps Potsdam just doesn't really sound all that great in English. Anyway, offering 3 square miles in the dining room might seem like a small thing, but it was actually this massive innovation, because it meant that 3 times a day, rain or shine, those passengers would leave their quarters and their rooms could be cleaned. Very quickly, we got the nickname the Spotless Fleet. And this was not just about being tidy. Everything, from the doctors at our hotel to the cleanliness on board our ships, it was all about getting passengers to New York in healthy condition. Because healthy passengers made it through Ellis Island.
Just south of where I am right now is Ellis Island, the great immigration station, where from 1892 to 1924, 18 million people passed through. Now, the immigrants were not allowed to come up to the piers of New York. The ship had to drop anchor south of here in the lower bay, and they would take them off in barges, tenders, or ferries, and all the third-class steerage passengers would go directly to Ellis Island, where beginning at about 9 in the morning, they would be processed by gruff customs and immigration people and doctors known as 30-second specialists as they hooked under eyelids and poked into ears looking for diseases. They were processed, and many of them were cleared by noon, would catch a ferry over to Manhattan or even here to Jersey City and start working in a factory the same afternoon in a pre-arranged job. They wanted to be Americans quickly. They wanted the idea that the streets were paved with gold. You could make your riches in America.
By the way, if a passenger was rejected at Ellis Island, guess who had to pay for their return voyage? We did. But that's only part of why we did all this. The main reason was that the people who made it through told their friends and relatives about us. Almost 99% of the immigrants that we carried on our Spotless Fleet were cleared at Ellis Island. Word spread about our fine service on board, and business was exploding. And so, it was time for us to build our first luxury liner, the Nieuw Amsterdam. Now, I could gush about her, but let's let the New York Times do the honors.
The new Holland America Liner, Nieuw Amsterdam, reached Hoboken after her maiden passage across the Atlantic yesterday afternoon. The ship, which is the largest flying the Dutch flag, as well as the best passenger vessel yet built for the New York-Rotterdam trade, resembles outwardly the other Holland America ships. There is a Dutch smoking room, a Japanese tea room. The social hall is furnished in the Empire style and will surely be one of the most popular apartments on the new ship.
Now that's what I call a good review. By the way, you might notice that the Nieuw Amsterdam had masts, but she never used sails. Well, we put those masts on the ship to assure the worried immigrants that the ship was safe and sound. It sort of was our version of the dummy smokestacks. And it worked. Immigrants flocked to Holland America Line. The stories are endless. Johnny Weissmuller, the Olympic athlete and one of the very first Tarzans, he immigrated to the United States on the Rotterdam 3. Herbert Hoover, Cary Grant, Katharine Hepburn, Clark Gable, Deborah Carr, Louis Armstrong, they all traveled on Holland America Line ships. Hey, we can even take credit for some of the greatest comedies of the last 50 years. See, Billy Crystal's grandfather immigrated on one of our ships, so if it weren't for us, there would be no City Slickers or Harry Met Sally, so you're welcome. And of course, there's also this recognizable fellow, Albert Einstein. He traveled to the United States for the very first time aboard one of our ships. He did that on the Rotterdam, the 4th Rotterdam, the flagship of our fleet and our very first ship of state. The Rotterdam 4 was built in 1908 and she was amazing. She was the largest ever Dutch ship and she was the official seagoing palace of the Royal Dutch government. sort of the Dutch version of the SS France or the Queen Mary. Now, she was the very first ocean liner in the world to have a glass-enclosed promenade deck. And that might not really seem like a big deal, but it would actually be 4 more years before another ship had such a modern and forward-looking feature. And that ship, you all know her, was the Titanic. Actually, the Titanic is part of our story in more ways than one. In 1912, when White Star Line launched the Titanic, one of our founders sent his son George to scout the new ship. George Reuglin. He went on board the Titanic. He dined with the ship's designers. He met with the officials from White Star Line. He even sent telegrams to the captain of the Noordam, a Holland America Line ship that was crossing the Atlantic just ahead of the Titanic. The captain of the Noordam actually warned him of the ice ahead. If you listen carefully in the film, you can hear our ship mentioned. But of course, it was of no help. Very sadly, our founder's son was among the 1,500 that perished on that tragic voyage. It really was a tragedy. But that tragedy wouldn't stop us. World War I didn't stop us, or immigration quotas, not even prohibition. We just continued to do what we had always done. We found a way to think differently.
In 1929, Wall Street crashed, and the passenger ship industry to Europe plummeted by 50%. A million people crossed in 1930, 500,000 5 years later. So Holland America, like all the companies, was hemorrhaging money. So in America, we had prohibition, you couldn't drink. So they developed an idea of one-night cruises for $10, where you would sail from New York at 5 p.m. You would get to the 3-mile limit at 7 p.m. They could open up the bars legally because they were past the 3-mile limit. Americans could drink themselves through the whole night and hopefully be sober enough to walk ashore the next morning. $10 booze cruises. Cruising was like Hollywood movies in the 30s. It was a form of escapism. So Holland America emphasized the nutrients in sea air. It would calm your nerves. You'd worry less about your financial troubles. You'll come back renewed.
Our approach to prohibition was so successful that despite the Great Depression, we built our most luxurious ship ever, the Nieuw Statendam II. Still considered to be, along with the Normandy of France, one of the most beautiful ships ever built. Again, I'm going to let the New York Times handle this one.
British observers who landed at Southampton after making the overnight journey to inspect the ship were deeply impressed with her, not only as the most modern thing in marine architecture, but also as a distinct and unique achievement in art. The Nieuw Amsterdam is the greatest ship ever to come out of Holland, and those who have seen her predict that she will produce a sensation in New York unlike that of any other vessel in the North Atlantic trade.
Sensation is a perfect word for the Nieuw Amsterdam II. She was our very first ship to feature something that was called ocean liner design. See, before Nieuw Amsterdam, our ships looked more like home. Dark interiors, heavy fabrics, fireplaces. Great idea on a ship, fireplaces. You were supposed to feel like you were in a Dutch villa on shore, not at sea. But with Nieuw Amsterdam II, we tried something different.
It was Art Deco at sea, it was magnificent, it had everything right about it. It was floating Ginger Rogers with sleek stainless banisters and ebony and modern decor. Out went the chocolate rooms and the heavy carpets. She was instantly one of the most popular ships. In fact, she was dubbed the ship of tomorrow because she was so modern inside.
And with Nieuw Amsterdam II, we even revolutionized entertainment on board. In the early days, our lounges featured a piano for the guests to play, like in the parlors of the old country. That was your onboard entertainment. A few drinks, and the hope that someone who was crossing the Atlantic with you would be able to play a few popular songs. Well, we still do the few drinks thing, however now we provide the piano player. Well, that all started on Nieuw Amsterdam. It even had an entire theater, and Nieuw Amsterdam featured performances by all kinds of artists. And fast forward 100 years, we went from this to this. The past was gone. The ocean liner really was the future. But less than a year after New Amsterdam made her first voyage, everything changed.
War breaks out in Europe. 2 days after Germany's surprise attack on Poland, France and England have declared war on the Nazis. With widespread fighting imminent, countless civilians are left to wonder, where will we go that is safe?
My parents literally smuggled themselves across the Polish border in early '39.
We arrived at the Rotterdam train station around midnight on the 25th of March, without any money at all. We spent 2 weeks in Rotterdam waiting for the ship to sail. Finally, one evening in early April, we boarded our ship. For the first 3 days, our vessel threaded her way carefully across the English Channel to avoid the mines.
It was tense all the way. There were frequent rumors of U-boats and of turning back to Europe. At night, the ship was blacked out, dark. The potholes had been painted over, drapes and curtains were drawn by late afternoon, and only low wattage bulbs were used in the lounges and in the cabins.
We were in the English Channel and the war had started, and the ship turned out all the lights, and we laid all night in the English Channel because of fear of submarines. And then the next day we started the trip to New York, and partway through the trip we saw the ocean all around us was covered with logs, and it was a Canadian lumber ship that had been torpedoed by the Germans, and we picked up the survivors.
On the day we finally rounded Land's End and headed out into the open Atlantic, the ship's radio brought us the news of Hitler's surprise attack.
Rotterdam was bombed, the whole of the city center was bombed. Around 850 people lost their lives. Around 20,000 people lost their home, which is a lot. And also the harbor, the port was bombed.
During that bombardment, one of our largest ships, the Statendam, was hit. In the midst of the destruction, this very symbol of our company burned and burned for days and days.
A lot of people were emotional about it. That Statendam was it was burning, and they tried to save it, but they couldn't. The whole city center of Rotterdam was burning. I mean, 30,000 buildings were gone. You can't imagine how it must have been for people to live in the city at that moment. All those people having no homes, the fire, there was no water. Everything was broken. It must have been awful.
The Dutch government had wanted to be neutral, but now they had no choice. The war had come to the Netherlands, and so they called on the Dutch ships of state to join the war effort. Nieuw Statendam, too, our most luxurious ship yet, was to become a military vessel. First, she steamed to Halifax, where her military conversion began. From there, she went to Singapore, where her millions of dollars of art and furniture were placed into storage. And then, on December the 22nd of 1940, she entered service.
At the outbreak of World War II, I was in South Africa.
That's Cecil Renfield. When we interviewed him, he was 97 years old. He joined the Navy in South Africa and was then transferred to the British Royal Navy to join the battle for Europe. The only way he could get home to fight was on board Nieuw Amsterdam.
Before the war, I was a cabin boy on the old Orient line, and I knew a lot about merchant ships, and I knew about the Nieuw Amsterdam was, I would say, the pride of Holland in those days. Wow, it was the biggest ship I'd ever seen or ever been on. When we got on board that troop ship, it was packed. We were packed like sardines. If you lifted your head up, you cracked your head on the bunk above you.
All the troop carriers were extremely crowded, and New Amsterdam was no different. Before the war, she could carry a little over 1,200 passengers. But during the war, at her capacity, she held over 8,000 troops at a time. Think about that for a minute. 8,000 troops. Even the swimming pool was drained and filled with enough bunks for 300 soldiers. And despite the cramped conditions, Nieuw Amsterdam maintained the world-famous Holland America Line service. For example, while most troop carriers only managed 2 hot meals a day, soldiers traveling on board Nieuw Amsterdam were treated to 3 square meals. The amount of food that was needed to feed these soldiers was frankly mind-boggling. And every single day, the ship's kitchens went through 240 gallons of milk, 80 bags of flour, over 12,000 eggs, 1,000 pounds of bacon, and 14,000 loaves of bread. When lamb stew was on the menu, it took 110 whole lambs. And when beef brisket was served, it took about 4,000 pounds of beef. By the way, just for a comparison, these days we use about 5,000 fewer eggs. Now on the other hand, we have way more steaks and lobster tails and ice cream, and of course also a lot more booze. But you know what? It's interesting. Because what Cecil remembers the most is not the brisket or the eggs, none of the food at all. It's actually something much, much deeper.
The feeling of fear was always back in your mind. We'd heard through what we call the grapevine of so many other ships being sunk. And it was quite strange because on the Nieuw Amsterdam, we had no escort. There were no ships with us at all. We just sailed alone.
But the Nieuw Amsterdam was very fast and the German U-boats couldn't keep up with it. So she escaped, and being painted gray, she could slip into fog or disappear on the horizon.
By the time the war was over, Nieuw Amsterdam had steamed over 500,000 miles, carrying almost 400,000 troops, including tens of thousands for the invasion of Normandy. Only the Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth carried more troops than our Nieuw Amsterdam, but they were also twice her size. After the war, it took 13 months to return her to her former beauty, and it cost nearly as much as it did to build her in the first place. But you know what? It was worth it. Because when she finally returned home to Rotterdam, she received what can only be described as a hero's welcome.
In 1946, 1 year after the war ended, it returned to Holland, and it steamed into Rotterdam, still scarred in rust and the gray paint, and to the Dutch people, it was the symbol of liberation more than anything else, and they painted the Holland America stacks in the yellow, green, and white, and the people dubbed it the darling of the Dutch. We are truly free. The Nieuw Amsterdam has come back to Holland.
And the ship was welcomed like you would welcome a queen or a president. The new waterway in the river, there were a lot of ships really with flags and people alongside the quays really welcoming the ship back. And in a way you can say that for at least the people from Rotterdam, war really ended at the moment that the Nieuw Amsterdam was back in this city.
Of our 20-ship fleet, only 10 survived the war. One of them, Westerdam, was sunk 3 times. 3 times! And yet she was the very first ship to return to New York Harbor after the war was over.
In 1946, when the Westerdam was the first liner to come back after the war, she sailed right on this path on the Hudson River. It probably was early morning at 7 a.m. Maybe a tugboat or two or a flyboat escorted her up the river. She was dressed in flags, and she slowly made her progress up to Hoboken, which would be a little further north than where I am right now, in Jersey City. But she'd make a graceful sight, and she looked pretty against the New York City skyline. You know, the new ship, morning, wonderful, a beginning.
It was the end of the war and the start of a whole new era. Okay, so something we haven't talked about yet is this thing that we do with the names of our ships. First of all, our passenger ships all end with the word dam or dam. And when we still had cargo ships, they all ended with this, dijk or dike, as in things that keep water from flooding a city. Now, I'm telling you this for a reason. The names of our ships are very important to us. So important, in fact, that we repeat them over and over and over again. There have been 3 Volendams and 3 Rijndams. We've had 4 Nieuw Amsterdams and 5.5 Statendams. One is obviously technically called a Nieuw Statendam, but it still counts. So you might wonder, why do we do all this? Well, remember what I said in the beginning about how stories can help us learn from our past, become stronger from our failures, wiser from our victories? How do you do all that? You do it by remembering and by honoring the past that continues to shape our future. And you know what? It matters. It really, really matters. On the maiden voyage of our Nieuw Statendam, we met a man who you actually heard earlier, Fred Heijn. He escaped the Nazis in 1939 on Statendam 3, and then he chose to cruise on Nieuw Statendam all those years later, 80 years later, so that he could reconnect to his past. You know, in this way our ships become time machines. They are receptacles of your memories and your family's memories, and they echo with the voyages of the past. Now, of course, there's been one name that we've returned to more than any other: Rotterdam. Yeah, there have been a lot of Rotterdams in our history. In fact, we had 4 ships named Rotterdam before our company was even 40 years old. But of all the Rotterdams, there is none more important to our story and none that better illustrates our hero's journey than Rotterdam 5, the Grand Dam of the Spotless Fleet. Here you can see her in September of 1958. 50,000 people lined the banks of the Rotterdam shipyard because they all wanted to watch Queen Juliana christen her. Now, she was stunning. She was the first ship to really and truly look like a modern cruise ship.
The Rotterdam was so unique, she didn't have a smokestack. She had twin uptakes on the outside, and her decor was very, very modern. Ships were becoming more like floating hotels. Gymnasiums, swimming pools, shopping arcades, movie theaters. They were becoming really hotels at sea or resorts at sea. And the Rotterdam was one of the great statements of, well, extraordinary maritime design for her period.
And when we talk about extraordinary design, we have to talk about one of Holland America Line's greatest contributions to cruising, the Lido Cafe. You can step in from the pool, grab a bite, and go right back to your sunbathing. Once again, you're welcome. Now, she was the future, and her timing was terrible. Only a month after she was launched, the world changed again.
In October 1958, the first jet flies from London to New York. The shipping industry announces flying is a fad, it will pass. It's a mere ripple in the road of travel. In 6 months, the airlines had 2/3 of all the business. In 5 years, 98%.
That plane took only 6 hours to cross the ocean. 6 hours? A trip that ocean liners made in 6 days. Frankly, that should have been the end of our story. If not for Rotterdam 5. Because just like we had innovated in the past, every detail of Rotterdam 5 really seemed to predict the end of the transatlantic business, but also the beginning of something new. Take, for example, the staircase. There was a movable partition that could be closed to create a first class and tourist class for transatlantic crossings, or we could open it to create a single class ship, and that was perfect for cruising. Even the first and tourist class dining rooms were identical. The first class dining room was just a little closer to the kitchen, so your food was a little warmer. Anyway, Rotterdam 5 was a huge success. She cruised the West Indies and the Caribbean, South America and Europe. And in 1961, she began a yearly tradition of circumnavigating the world.
Some people would take the world cruise every year. It was like a floating clubhouse. They'd bring their own favorite foods, their own furniture, so they'd feel at home. It was magic. There were all sorts of stories. The lady who took 300 dresses for 95 days. What about the lady who took 2 suites? One was for her harp. What about the lady who took a second suite for her stuffed animal collection, which she traveled with around the world?
The best, though, is the woman who brought her plastic surgeon. Imagine, she left for a 95-day cruise and came back looking 20 years younger. Talk about a time machine.
She's also one of those ships that was beloved, a certain kind of chemistry that you don't build in the shipyard, but it's in the woodwork and the paneling that just engulfs people, so passengers and crew love that ship.
And if you actually want an amazing time machine experience, Rotterdam 5 is now a floating hotel in Rotterdam Harbor. So for those of you who are making it to Rotterdam, please go pay her a visit. You can go on board and walk her halls. You can see her beautiful design and touch the steam engines. You can even see the saltwater pool and explore the past right in front of you. It's honestly breathtaking. But you know what my favorite thing is? When we call in Rotterdam, every time we call in Rotterdam, we sound our ship's whistle as a salute. Because Rotterdam 5 was more than just a beloved ship. She really was the thing that allowed us to go from being a fleet of ocean liners that occasionally cruised to really making cruising the entirety of our business. But by the time the 60s rolled around, we had entered a new battleground in the cruising industry. See, other fleets were making the same adjustments that we had made. And so we found ourselves once again in competition for passengers. And so we had to find a unique advantage, and we had to do it fast. Because the 60s may have been swinging, but the 70s brought about oil embargoes and financial crisis. And suddenly we had major choices to make. The first thing that we did was we shuttered our cargo operations. We've had about 80 cargo ships in our history, but from that moment on, there would never be another one. And things were starting to look a little bleak. I'll let Captain Case explain. Back in the 70s, he was on one of our last few passenger ships still in operation, the Transatlantic.
There were only 3 or 4 passenger ships left, and that was not enough to sustain the company and pay for the overhead. So it was felt that we need to offer new and exciting adventures. In the mid-1970s, the company was associated with West Tours, a very successful tour company here in Alaska. So they decided, we're going to bring that Transatlantic to Alaska.
That's right. While the rest of the world was focusing on cruising the warm waters of the Caribbean, we took one of our last ships and sent it thousands of miles into the wrong direction.
I was on the Transatlantic. That was the very first ship slotted to go to Alaska. Alaska was different, very, very, very different than it is now. If you walked in Juneau, there were no jewelry shops like you find everywhere in the Caribbean. There were no tour buses. We used school buses. That was all what was available in those days. Sitka had 3 taxis, then it was it.
Also, there was another problem. Transatlantic was in Asia, and so she had to get across the Pacific to start her first Alaska cruise. And it turned out that was a bit tricky in the days before GPS and computer-guided navigation.
This was supposed to be a 10-day North Pacific crossing. And this was in April. And we left Yokohama and it was dense fog. Couldn't see anything for days. So here we go, basically the old-fashioned way, dead reckoning. You estimate how fast the ship is going, you know your course, and you plot in the chart, every day where you are. So I'm on the bridge, and I look on the radar, and I look outside, and I look on the radar again, and I see land. It's supposed to be land for at least another day, to our estimate. So I called the captain. I said, "Captain, oi, land in sight." He said, "What the hell are you talking about? It's not 1650. Yeah, it's 1975. He said, "Come on the bridge, I see land." these are the snow-capped mountains, from Vancouver Island.
It turned out that they had arrived a full 24 hours early. Remember what I said earlier about never being behind the curve again? Oh, it's kind of amazing that we were ahead of schedule for our very first Alaska cruise, because we were way ahead of everyone else anyway when it came to Alaska. And it paid off. Thousands of people wanted to explore that new destination. So many, in fact, that we had to start bringing more ships from New York over to the West Coast.
The ships needed to move from New York to Vancouver, and that's a long way. So we needed to come up with a cruise to do that make it attractive for people to say, hey, I've never been with a ship through the Panama Canal. Hey, there are interesting ports down in the Caribbean that we normally don't go to. The company always found a way to persevere. It's hard to say you did well when times are difficult, but it's not how you go in, but how you come out.
It's not how you go in, but how you come out. In just a few years, we became an Alaska powerhouse. We bought a train there and a resort, and we really helped transform Alaska into what it is today, a top destination in the world. It's amazing. That one idea, Cruise Alaska, it changed everything. And I like to think of it as kind of poetic justice. The jet plane almost ruined us, but just by taking risks and by stepping out of what was comfortable, we survived. And don't get me wrong, jet planes are pretty amazing. They can get you all over the world, but jet planes cannot show you this up close. Alaska was so successful that despite the economic disaster of the 70s, we were planning to expand our fleet by 2 more ships. But then something happened. In the late 80s, Alaska put us on the radar of a small company in Florida. You may have heard of them, Carnival. Our partnership with Carnival immediately paid off. Instead of 2 ships, we took delivery on 12 ships in 12 years. Each one was a purpose-built cruise ship, and each one was built in the Fincantieri shipyard in Italy. Each one a symbol of how far we had come, and each ship was a symbol of our commitment to go further, deeper, to connect people to new experiences and to make new stories. It's a big idea and a lot of responsibility. And let me tell you, it's a responsibility that we take very seriously. As you all know, in 2020, we encountered a global tragedy that affected lives and communities everywhere and totally disrupted the cruise industry. In all our history, the COVID-19 pandemic perhaps was one of the biggest challenges we've ever faced. The world ground to a halt, and we embarked on what was going to be the most challenging voyage ever. A voyage of uncertainty, sadness, pain, hopelessness, and frustration. We knew what we had to do first. First, we had to make sure that all our guests and team members got back home safely. And to be honest with you, it was really hard. One of the hardest things we've ever had to go through. People were stuck on ships. We had people stuck in hospitals. Our ships were not allowed to enter certain ports or dock in certain locations. Some of our guests and team members were even denied entry into their own countries. But most sadly, some people even lost their lives. It felt as if we were floating on a sea of despair, calling out for help, but there was no one there to save us. So yes, it was hard. But as hard as it was, we were committed to doing everything and anything it was going to take. Holland America Line joined the largest peacetime repatriation effort in the history of the world. Planes were grounded, borders were closed, and so it took unprecedented cooperation and nearly 6 months, but finally we got it done. This photo was taken on June the 4th in 2020. There we are, along with dozens of other ships in Manila Bay. And eventually we had ships all over the world. where we waited and mourned and hoped for a light. So, now that we are all here together, back at sea, doing what we love most, we are perhaps most importantly once again hopeful for the future. Remember what Captain K said? It's not about how you go in, but how you come out. So how do we come out of this? Well, we have always believed that there's a power in travel. It binds us together, it helps us dream, and it helps us forge new memories. And so now more than ever, we are embracing our past as we continue to move forward with many new beginnings, including a recent one, our newest 7th Rotterdam, named like so many before her after our home. A reminder of our resilience and an expression of hope that yes, there are times of hardship, but there are also still many journeys that lie ahead. And with that beautiful sentiment in mind, I would like to talk about just one more thing before I let you go to enjoy the rest of this day. Something that really has been ingrained in our company's history and therefore is extremely important to us. Our godmothers. For thousands of years, ship captains of nearly every single world culture have looked to the heavens to protect their ships against the unknown. As recent as only a few hundred years ago, women were carved into the bows of ships to give the captains better sight. Now we do something a little different. We have godmothers. And our tradition started with our very first ship, Rotterdam. She was dedicated by the captain's daughter. Our second ship, Maasdam, was similarly godmothered by the captain's daughter. And since that day, every single ship that we've had has had a godmother looking over her. We've had actresses and television personalities, we've had athletes, we even had the Olsen twins. We've had 11 members of the Dutch royal family, including 4 princesses and 4 queens. Queen Wilhelmina was the one to dedicate Nieuw Amsterdam to. By the way, fun fact about her, at one time she was the richest woman in the world, and she was the very first female billionaire. Now, my royal family may not be the flashiest, but they are for sure one of the most beloved. When Queen Juliana blessed the Rotterdam 5, as I mentioned earlier, 50,000 people showed up to watch. Her daughter, Queen Beatrix, was the godmother of 2 ships, Statendam 4 and the one and only Suriname. And our current queen, Queen Maxima, not only watches over Nieuw Amsterdam, she also watches over Koningsdam, a ship named for her husband, King Willem-Alexander, the first male monarch of the Netherlands in over a century. And get this, we even welcomed Oprah Winfrey into our family of godmothers when she dedicated our beautiful Nieuw Statendam, which she did in February of 2019. And the Rotterdam 7, our beautiful new flagship, was blessed by Princess Margriet. She actually holds the record for most Holland America Line ships ever christened, and she proudly continues that rich tradition. Our hero story has lasted for nearly 152 years, and it has simply been extraordinary. We survived 2 world wars, the death of the ocean liner, a Great Depression, and multiple economic crises. We've circled the globe, carried generations of passengers, and seen the birth of countless eras. So, what do we learn from all of this? Besides some fun historic tidbits, there's an old saying I would love to share with you. The pessimist complains about the wind, the optimist expects it to change, the realist adjusts the sails. I know, it's a little corny to do a sailing metaphor on a ship, but this one really works because it perfectly sums up the journey of our hero, Holland America Line. With every change, every difficulty in every era, we observed, learned, and reflected. And then we made the adjustments that put us where we are today, almost 152 years later. Stronger, wiser, and ready to continue taking people to new worlds. I want to leave you with some last words from Bill Miller. I think he puts this whole thing pretty well.
It's not about rivets or steel or carpets or artwork. It's the magic that somehow that a ship has when it comes in the beginning that just extends to everybody, and they just love it. They've been a wonderful family. They've been my friends. I've watched them come and they go, their life stories. It's like a great big maritime soap opera with all these actresses playing these parts. When I put my little head on the pillow at night, I think the ships are still here, thank God. It's wonderful.
And so, on behalf of the 15,000 current team members of Holland America Line and all of those who have come before, I want to thank you for joining me here today. But most importantly, I want to thank you for being part of our story. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of this day. Thanks everyone.